Welcome to the Non-Skinnerian podcast, where we will challenge you not just to think logically, but to think psychologically. Here we dive into the fascinating world of behavioral economics and gamification, uncovering how deep psychological insights can transform the way you design, build, and lead. Welcome back, dear listeners, to the Non-Skinnerian podcast, where we venture beyond the logical and deep dive into the psychological. I'm your host, Roman Rackwitz. In our last episode, so the first introduction episode of the podcast, we ended with a call to keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep thinking psychologically. Since then, I've received a few messages asking, okay, what exactly do you mean by psychological thinking? Well, today we are going to answer that question. Today we are going to challenge one of the most cherished beliefs in business, economics, and even our personal lives: the belief in the supremacy of logic and reason. Now, don't get me wrong, logic is an incredibly powerful tool. It has helped us build bridges, launch rockets, and develop the technology that powers this very podcast. But what if I told you that sometimes logic can lead us astray? That in the complex, messy world of human behavior, the most rational decision isn't always the right one? Today we are going to explore the idea that while logic and reason are important, they can also create blind spots that, if left unchecked, can cause us to overlook more creative, intuitive, and ultimately more effective solutions. Let's begin with a story. One that might seem familiar if you've ever dealt with customer feedback. So a large airline was facing a significant issue. The passengers were complaining about long wait times at baggage claim. The logical solution? Well, you might think they'd increase the number of baggage handlers or speed up the luggage delivery process. And that's exactly what they did. But the complaints didn't stop. In fact, they barely reduced at all. So what did they do next? Instead of focusing on logic, they applied a bit of psychologic. They moved the arrival gates further away from baggage claim, so passengers had to walk a longer distance to get there. And guess what? Complaints dropped almost to zero. The wait time hadn't changed much, but passengers felt like they were being productive while walking, rather than just standing around. It's a perfect example of how sometimes the logical solution isn't the most effective one. This reminds me about another story when it was about waiting time in front of elevators. So instead of making the elevators faster, just by putting a mirror in front of them, people now were occupied by looking at themselves, and suddenly the waiting time wasn't so awful anymore. Now let's talk about what I like to call the tyranny of logic. Rory Sutherland, whose work we'll be referencing throughout this podcast probably much more often, has a fascinating take on this. He argues that we have become also obsessed with logical solutions that we often miss out on better, more creative answers. And this isn't just theoretical. It's something that happens in a boardroom, government office, and even in our everyday lives. Let me give you an example. It's also from Rory Sutherland, by the way. Imagine you're tasked with creating a new soft drink to rival Coca-Cola. What would you do? Most people would suggest them something that tastes better, costs less, and maybe comes in a bigger bottle. Logical, right? But here's the kicker. Red Bull, one of Coca-Cola's biggest competitors, did the exact opposite. It's expensive, comes in a tiny can, and let's be honest, not so many people would describe the taste of Red Bull as amazing. But it worked. Why? Because they broke the rule of logic and tapped into something deeper, the psychologic. Red Bull succeeded not because it followed the logical path, but because it understood that consumers don't always make decisions based purely on taste or cost. The brand cultivated an image of extreme energy and high performance, and people were willing to pay a premium for that association, even if the product itself was less than delightful to taste. There's a connection between also how medical treatment tastes, right? It's proven that people believe more in the efficiency or effectiveness of medical treatment that doesn't taste as good as other medical treatment. We are conditioned with the feeling that if it helps you, it probably may not taste so good. So it's just a subjective experience. And this brings us to this important concept of psychologic. While logic is about making decisions based on reason and data, psychologic takes into account the messy, emotional, and often irrational nature of human behavior. Sutherland coined this term to describe how people often make decisions to seem illogical on the surface, but actually make perfect sense when you understand the underlying psychology. Let's dive deeper into this with another example. Have you ever wondered why luxury brands don't have sales? Logic would dictate that if a product isn't selling, you should lower the price to increase demand, but luxury brands understand that their value isn't just in the product itself, it's in the exclusivity, the prestige that comes with it. Lowering the price would diminish the perception, so they don't. And what happens? The product remain desirable, even more so because they are perceived as exclusive and unattainable. It's psychologic at work. How often do we think this way when we are thinking about how can we sell services more often? Or how can we increase the demand of a particular, otherwise more convenient service? Wouldn't it be possible to create some sense of scarcity by, starting with a waiting list before you're offering your service? So people know that, okay, there seems to be a waiting list. So, okay, there seems to be some kind of demand. I mean, of course, often there are reasons not to do that. But if I'm honest, I think that too often we are not even considering that kind of possibility. Or take the concept of choice architecture, something we'll explore in more detail in future episodes for sure. This idea revolves around how the presentation of choices can dramatically influence decisions. A simple change in how options are framed can lead to a completely different outcome. For instance, a study showed that when organ donation was the default option on forms with the choice to opt out rather than opt in, participation rates skyrocketed. Logic might suggest that people should make such an important decision consciously, but psychologic shows that that making the default option the desired behavior can significantly influence outcomes. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Roman, but isn't more data supposed to lead to better decisions? In theory, yes. But in practice, data can sometimes blind us to the bigger picture. Take the 2016 US presidential election, for example. Hillary Clinton's campaign was driven by data and logical strategies. But Donald Trump, with his seemingly irrational approach, won. Why? Probably, or it could be, because his unpredictability and willingness to break the rules of logic resonated with voters in a way that Clinton's data-driven approach did not. It's a stark reminder that relying too heavily on logic and data can sometimes lead us down the wrong path. Logic is predictable, and in a world where everyone is trying to out-logic each other, being unpredictable, being a little bit irrational, can actually be an advantage. This brings to mind a concept in game theory known as the Madame theory, famously used by Richard Nixon. The idea is that if you act unpredictably and people believe you are willing to do anything, even something seemingly irrational, they'll be more likely to avoid pushing your buttons. Trump's campaign, whether by design or accident, I don't know that, but played into this concept, making his threats and promises more believable simply because they didn't follow conventional logic. So how can we embrace this idea of psychologic in our own lives and businesses? It starts with being open to the illogical. When faced with a problem, don't just ask, what's the logical solution? Ask, what's the psychological solution? Here's a little experiment we can try. The next time you're making a decision, whether it's in your business or personal life, consider doing something that seems a bit irrational. Maybe it's raising the price of a product when sales are down. Maybe it's investing in a marketing strategy that doesn't make logical sense but feels right. The point is to be open to solutions that don't fit the traditional mold of logic. You might be surprised by the results. And while we are on the subject of embracing the illogical, let's talk about something many of us encounter regularly: meetings. We have all sat through meetings that feel like a waste of time. Logically, they should be efficient, with clear agendas and outcomes. And I mean, there are so many examples right now out there, at least they are coming up in my stream, where you can always read about how Steve Jobs got rid of meetings, or how Jeff Bezos designed meetings to be short, or whatever. And of course, from a logical point of view, it makes sense. Why not? But what if the purpose of a meeting isn't just to get things done? What if it's also about building relationships, fostering creativity, or even just providing a break in the day? When we view meetings through a psychological lens, we can start to see value in the small talks, the tangents, and the seemingly unproductive moments. They are not just distractions, they are part of the human experience that builds trust and rapport, which in turn can lead to better outcomes in the long run. To wrap up, let's recap what we have covered today. We have challenged the idea that logic and reason are always the best guides for decision making, right? We have explored that the concept of Psychologic, where human behavior often defies logical explanations, but still makes perfect sense when you dig deeper. And we have discussed how embracing a bit of irrationality can sometimes lead to better, more creative outcomes. So, until then, until the next episode, remember, don't just think logically, think psychologically. I'm Roman Rackwitz, and this has been the first episode of the Non-Skinnerian podcast. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep questioning the obvious.